This lecture is called Deciphering Hanul Ut in Gurdjieff's World Creation. Our understanding has been muddled by associating the octave note discontinuities of P.D. Ouspensky's In Search of the Miraculous with Gurdjieff's Stoppender Middelins in Holy Planet Purgatory in Beelzebub's Tales. This essay will show that note discontinuities do not exist, and how Hanul Ut's threefold dissociative identity disorder can be cured by redefinition and simplification. In this process, it will be shown that the apparent contradictions that have arisen have come about by trying to introduce the 9 positions of the Enneagram into the 7 positions of the octave, without including the action of the law of 3, Triamazikamno, within the law of 7, Heptaparapashanak, especially in the world creation of his endlessness. And here is a quote from Beelzebub's Tales. Our common father, omni-being endlessness, having decided to change the principle of the maintenance of the existence of this then still unique cosmic concentration and sole place of his most glorious being, first of all altered the process itself of the functioning of the 2 primordial fundamental sacred laws, and he actualized the greater change in the law of the sacred Heptaparapashanak. Now, may I beg his endlessness's pardon, but no change in Triamazikamno is discussed. And this is exactly the problem. The octave note discontinuities in Ouspensky chapters 7 and 14, Mi Fa, Ti Do, and Sol La, not a discontinuity, but suggested by symmetry. Gurdjieff's Stoppender Middelins in Holy Planet Purgatory. This is a quote. The first 2 Middelins were constated by the twin brothers Kun Kil Tez and Kun Tru Pe after the loss of Atlantis, and added to the 7 notes to be the law of ninefoldness. The 3 gaps in the Stoppender octave are described as created by his endlessness. Mi Fa, mechano-coinciding Middelin. His endlessness lengthened the Stoppender Mi Fa, mechano-coinciding Middelin, with the purpose of providing the requisite inherency for receiving, for its functioning, the automatic affluence of all forces that were near. Ti Do, he shortened the Stoppender Ti Do, intentionally actualized Middelin, to be dependent only upon the affluence of forces obtained from outside through that Stoppender. And Sol La, Hanul Ut, its disharmony flowed by itself from the change of the 2 aforementioned Stoppenders. Apparently Gurdjieff derived these 2 Middelins from the 2 discontinuities in Ouspensky, and ascribed their characteristics based on the influences in certain situations. For Mi Fa, the first Middelin, he observed that the ray of creation has organic life on this planet, and acting as a bridge for the passage of Mi Fa, and also that the air from the lungs in the food octave performs the same function. Thus he uses the word automatic and near. For Ti Do, Si Do, he observed that in the ray of creation, the energies appear to flow easily from the ending Do in the higher octave into the lower octave through the gap of T, and thus are dependent on affluence from the outside octave. Since Sol La is not a discontinuity, but seems to be necessary for the symmetry as shown in the previous Ouspensky figure, he ascribes a complicated threefold action to be discussed later on. The problem arises that upon further analysis using music theory and adding half notes, these discontinuities in the Ouspensky musical octave in just intonation disappear. And more of this is in my essay, All and Everything About Gurdjieff's Stopenders. And here is the octave in just intonation, and this is in musical theory. I used all the notes and half notes using the formula interval -1 times 360 and arranged these notes and half notes around the circle, showing the triangle in the middle of the circle. And the percentages of these notes on the scale are shown. The surprising results in this diagram is that all three vertices of the triangle exactly match three of the most consonant intervals: the root note of the octave unison, the perfect fourth fa, and the major sixth la. And the sequence do unison, fa perfect fourth, la major sixth clearly leads harmonically to the next octave do, and this follows the inner triangle. And the most consonant perfect fifth sol in the bottom center, directly opposite the apex of the triangle, is there as if echoing the unison. And the note T wants to resolve into do. More importantly is to observe and hear how the three sets of three within the octave demonstrate how the law of three acts within the law of 7 notes. Active is mi fa sol, neutralizing sol la ti, and passive ti do re. And these are the three sets. Next, we look at how this relates to Gurdjieff's world creation in Holy Planet Purgatory. This just intonation diagram appears to be the original state of the universe before creation, and thus it is clearly auto-egocrat, everything in balance, with the law of 3 Triomazhikamno fitting perfectly in the law of 7 Heptaparapashnak. There is no action possible, as the so-called discontinuities or points of action do not exist, but the only problem is that in auto-egocrat, we do not exist. To prevent the erosion of his universe from the flow of time, his endlessness changed the universe to trago auto-egocrat by lengthening and shortening 2 stopenders. And here we might imagine Mullah Nasser-Eddin saying, by monkeying around with the perfection of creation, God has essentially created angels and devils, and among them, us humans. And here's a quote. These changes in the functioning of the sacred Heptaparapashnak consisted in this, that in 3 of the stopenders, he altered the what is called subjective actions, which had been then in the stopenders. And in this respect, that he lengthened the law-conformable successiveness and shortened it in another, and in a third disharmonized it. Now first it must be understood that a stopender is not the same as a musical note. Even though it is implied by chapter 40, Beelzebub tells how people learned about and again forgot the fundamental cosmic law of Heptaparapashnak. A musical note on Beelzebub's piano cannot be lengthened or shortened. If a singer lengthens a note, it is called a sustain, which sets a steady amplitude level and does not change its tone or pitch, aside from some overtones. If the mathematical representation of the note is raised or lowered by vibrometers, as described in chapter 41, Bukharian Dervish Haji Asvith Truv, it would be out of tune and cause the effect of a boil, as in that chapter. My ingenious explanation to the dilemma of lengthening and shortening stopenders can be seen in these 2 diagrams in my essay, Gurdjieff's creation story deciphered in 2 enneagrams. And here, auto-egocrat, body, spirit, and soul, is mapped around 360 degrees with a protractor, as shown previously. And in the second frame, showing endlessness altered stoppenders, you'll see the active mechano-coinciding Midland, Honol Ut, and the intentionally actualized Midland, T Do. Now, what I proposed here is that the lengthening happened between Mi and Fa because that moved the note Fa down below from where it did connect in just intonation on the edge of the triangle, further down, to match the enneagram point. And in the other case, you could say that he shortened the distance between Ti and Do, which pulled up the La past the point of the triangle. And this explains the lengthening and shortening of the stoppenders, which really have nothing to do with notes. And note that in this process, 9 points were created for the enneagram, and the triangle fills the 2 points that are not filled, as in the enneagram, where the triangle is in the center of the enneagram notes. To visualize the problem more clearly, the just intonation note positions are shown superimposed on a precise enneagram, which was superimposed in an enneagram, with points numbered 1 through 9. And this is actually how you create the enneagram, which also gives the direction. And the 3 discontinuity points of action are shown with a red X. X1, Mi Fa, X2, Ti Do, and X3, Sol La, Honol Ut. In this diagram, it can be seen that the just intonation notes line up perfectly. Sol G is opposite Do C, and the other 3 notes, Fa, F, Do C, and La A, are actually on the corners where the inner triangle meets the circle. But this symmetry does not match the enneagram points, or the 3 places, X1, X2, X3, that Ouspensky and Gurdjieff show as discontinuities points of action. It is interesting that these 3 points of action, or discontinuity, do precede the inner triangle, which suggests that the inner triangle must facilitate their passage, rather than the discontinuities points of action. To step back from the problem, it is clear that what is trying to be done is to place the 9 points necessary for the enneagram into a circle of 7 points. However, it must be understood that to build an enneagram, a circle is initially divided into 9 parts, labeled 1 to 9. Then when dividing the numbers by 7, a repeating decimal is used to define the enneagram symbol and its direction. The unassigned numbers 3 and 6 are part of an inner triangle. This is where the confusion begins, because these points are then labeled Do to T, or C, like a piano by convention. But with the exception of Do, these positions, Mi to T, do not correspond to these notes on a piano. Now we might infer their similarity to actual notes, but as shown previously, musical harmony exists only in auto-egocrat, not in trago-auto-egocrat. Points of action only exist in an enneagram. And here's the enneagram, with the points of action and the direction. Now, if we look at the pas de Dieu dance of the devil and the angel in my essay, The Secret Enneagram of Gurdjieff and its relationship to vortex math, we begin to see a solution to Hanal Ut. The devil and the angel swap places as in a dance, pas de Dieu, around the circle. But there are 3 places where the action of the law of 3 acts and helps them around the circle. So the passive and active and neutralizing forces of the inner triangle of Triamazikamno, the blue arrows, assist the passage through the notes of the Enneagram. And here are the 6 sets of 2. On the left, the Enneagram controls, and on the right, the triangle controls. And this is what I theorize is Hanal Ut. Before proceeding, I must admit to a sleight of hand where on the last panel, the devil does not swap with the angel, but assists the angel to the next note. This was required for the devil to be at Do on the next swap. This may point to an idiosyncrasy in the neutral side, or it is perhaps normal for the neutral force. The complicated structure that Gurdjieff describes for Hanal Ut, that he links with his 2 midlands, as the main process that creates the whole Trago-autocratic universe which exists today, is not easily explainable. In fact, it seems more like magic. And here is the quote. As regards the 3rd Stapender, then changed in its subjective action, and which is 5th in general successiveness, and is called Hanal Ut, its disharmony flowed by itself from the change in the 2 aforementioned Stapenders. This disharmony in its subjective functioning flowing from its asymmetry, so to speak, in relation to the whole completing process of the sacred Heptaparapashanak, consists in the following. Number 1. If the completing process of the sacred law flows in conditions where during its process there are many extraneously caused vibrations, then all its functioning gives only external results. Number 2. But if this same process proceeds in absolute quiet, without any external extraneously caused vibrations whatsoever, then all the results of the action of its functioning remain within that concentration in which it completes its process, and for the outside, these results only become evident on direct and immediate contact with it. And 3. If, however, during its functioning there are neither of these 2 sharply opposite conditions, then the results of the action of its process usually divide themselves into external and internal. So there we have 1 producing external results, 2 producing internal results, and 3 producing external and internal results. Now, what I propose is that these 2 midland positions that are described with Hanal Ut and Hanal Ut combine a triangle. And number 1, the active force, Mi-Fa in Hanal Ut, is the mechano-coinciding midland, which I will call Hanal Ut number 1. And number 2, passive force, Ti-Do in Hanal Ut, is the intentionally actualized midland, which I will call Hanal Ut number 2. And 3, then the Hanal Ut position, Sol-La, called merely Hanal Ut, should be the neutral force, which I now rename Hanal Ut number 3. Now to further understand Hanal Ut, we should look at its cousin, Hanal Miezno, and see how it relates to Hanal Ut, especially in the food octave. The definition of Hanal Miezno is as follows, and here's the quote. And in regard to the 2nd primordial fundamental cosmic law, and namely the sacred Triamazikamno, common cosmic objective science also formulates with the words, and here's the quote, a new arising from the previously arisen through the Hanal Miezno, the process of which is actualized thus. The higher blends with the lower in order to actualize the middle, and thus becomes either higher for the preceding lower or lower for the succeeding higher. And the sacred Triamazikamno consists of three independent forces, and the first, Serp Orpheus, and the second, Serp Sicurus, and third, Serp Athanatus. Which three forces of the sacred Triamazikamno the said science calls as follows. Number 1, the first, affirming force or pushing force or simply force plus. 2, the second, the denying force or the resisting force or simply the force minus. And 3, the third, the reconciling force, equilibrating force or the neutral force. Each of these three forces are also part of Hanal Ut. It is necessary to tell you also that the first appearance of every kind of concentration from the ether or Kulna, which is found everywhere in the universe, owing to the second grade cosmic law, the attraction and fusion of similarities, proceeds in the following manner. If particles of ether or Krona, which are already found in the different spheres of all 7 stapenders of the fundamental cosmic and San Balazar, collide for some reason or other, they begin the arising of all kinds of crystallizations, which do not yet have any subjective properties, and furthermore, if these particles of ether or Krona fall for some reason or other into conditions where a process of Hanal Miezno proceeds, they fuse into one, and owing to the what is called complex vibrations acquired in them, are transferred into active elements already with definite specific properties. And if therefore these already definite active elements with their own specific subjective properties enter into the processes of Hanal Miezno, which have other conditions, they again fuse with each other according to the same law of affinity of vibrations, and thus acquiring these properties are transformed into active elements of another Optopanazakian class, and so on and so forth. Clearly, Hanal Miezno is a powerful force, as it has the ability to create every element. With Hanal Ut having the same prefix, one would expect that they must work together. In fact, it appears to confirm my definition of Hanal Ut by having the three forces acting within it. It appears that Hanal Miezno is using a local functioning of the law of three, facilitating the passage from one note to the other, whereas Hanal Ut acts as the law of three within the whole octave, as the central triangle, to fill those places that Hanal Miezno cannot act. And here's the food octave, and I have defined the points where Hanal Ut number 1, Hanal Ut number 2, and Hanal Ut number 3 act. Although Hanal Miezno can almost complete the food octave by itself, there are 3 places where Hanal Ut must assist, and which are, in fact, the points of the inner triangle. As indicated in my previous essay, the key to the soul is within the missing stopender in the Gejev food octave. There are problems with the food octave. My changes are noted in green. But for the purposes of this paper, they are not important. All that needs to be seen is the importance of Hanal Miezno in the process of creating food for the human body. And I have assumed that Hanal Miezno also acts at law T between the endocrine system and the sex center, although not mentioned by Gejev because of his error of not including the endocrine system. Clearly, there are 3 places where the so-called discontinuities are bridged to complete the processes, since Hanal Miezno, by itself, cannot proceed due to the changes of his endlessness from auto-egocrat to trago-auto-egocrat. The first position, between me and Fa, is where Gejev would place the mechano-coinciding midline to mimic world creation, and this would be Hanal Ut number 1 active force is acting from Do to Mi Fa, with the food from the digestive system and air from the lungs via the circulatory system. And the second position, where Gurdjieff would place Hanal Ut to mimic world creation, called by me Hanal Ut number 2, passive force, is acting from Mi Fa to So La with thought impressions from the brain. And the third position, between Ti and Do, where Gurdjieff would place the intentionally actualized Midland to mimic world creation, called by me Hanal Ut number 3, neutral force, is acting from So La to Do with love attraction from the endocrine system and the sexual system to conceive a child. So rather than having a complicated third force called Hanal Ut, So La, that can be changed in its action by chaos, quiet, or none of these, there is just the inner triangle which directs the complete process with its active, passive, and neutralizing sides. Note that this is contrary to common labeling the points of the triangle as active Do, passive Fa, and neutral So. Next, let us see how Hanal Ut can be applied to Ouspensky's ray of creation. The linear ray of creation in Search of the Miraculous appears to die in the moon, but in the holy planet Purgatory, Gurdjieff discards the one-dimensional ray of creation and presents a three-dimensional creation in time and space based upon Hanal Ut. And here I have associated the three levels. With Hanal Ut number 1, active force, Hanal Ut number 2, passive force, and Hanal Ut number 3, neutral force. The three forces of Hanal Ut create the three levels of the megalocosmos as follows. Sun and Milky Way created not by Hanal Ut, extraneously caused vibrations, external 100%, but by Hanal Ut number 1, active force. The Earth and solar system created not by Hanal Ut, absolute quiet, without any extraneously caused vibrations, internal 100%, but Hanal Ut number 2, passive force. And humans and organic life created not by Hanal Ut, neither of those two sharply opposite conditions, 50 external and 50 internal, but by Hanal Ut number 3, neutral force. Note that each of the three levels of creation is similar to Hanal Miezno, because the first cosmos and the second cosmos act together with neutral force coming from the previous level. For level 1, the exception, word God, Theomertamagalogus, is the neutral force. For level 2, level 1 is the neutral force. And for level 3, level 2 is the neutral force. So here are the different cosmoses: protocosmos, defertocosmos, macrocosmos, and this I got from Ouspensky. Tritocosmos, mesocosmos, tetratocosmos, and microcosmos. And then there are the levels. There's the first order sun, the second order sun, the grouping of second order suns, the third order sun, the grouping of third order suns, and then animals, photons, DNA. And then definition would be holy sun absolute, star, galaxy, planet, solar system, three brain beings, atoms, cells. And locally, of course, it would be the sun, the Milky Way, and souls. I'll talk about that later. The Earth, our solar system, and then Kestjan, astral bodies. Also talking about that later. Humans, elements, organic life. Now, the emanations are described specifically by Gurdjieff. He has thermomertamagalogus, mentecazone, polytheopal, dynomonazone, astroleucutiazone, and hambelazone, and then photozone. Unfortunately, with these emanations, which serve to describe the positions of the cosmoses, there is a mistake. Because if you look at the chapter on religion, chapter 38, Hambalazoin is shown to be on the level of the solar system, and therefore I've taken away his astroleucodezoin and replaced it with Hambalazoin, and then I made up a word for animals and humans called hemoglobizoin, and I'm sorry, but I see it that way. Okay, so there's the full chart, and now we'll go through each one individually, showing in which cosmos the potted Jew dancers end up. And here we are, we're in Thirdomagologus, Macrocosmos, and Differtocosmos. And you see where the line of Hanalut number 1 comes through as active force. And now I'm going to explain the issue of macrocosmos and mesocosmos, sharing a place with the spiritualization of mankind. So here there's Hanalut number 1, the protocosmos, macrocosmos, Differtocosmos, and the Thermatologus acting as the neutralizing force. And interestingly, the two cosmoses that are the grouping cosmoses, one is the grouping of the suns in the Milky Way galaxy, the macrocosmos, and the other one is the grouping of the planets in the solar system in the mesocosmos. I've shown on both sides here there's the first level of creation, and then there's the first level of creation, human image of God, which allows man to be in the image of God and to exist parallel to the universe. So with the first level of creation, there's a parallel to the human image of God, of man, and that exists in the macrocosmos. And this is, of course, the soul. And here we are to the second level of creation, Hanalut number 2. And you see how it's acting across from right to left on the bottom of the triangle. And here we have the mesocosmos, the tritocosmos. The neutralizing force is the star's sun in the previous level. And the parallel to this is the Kesjan astral bodies with Hambalazoin. And then the third level of creation, we have the dancers going from the left side of the triangle up to the top Do. This is the creation of the Tetatocosmos with hemoglobizoin made up by me and microcosmos. And the second level is acting here as the neutralizing force. And this is parallel to man. Because Tetatocosmos wasn't specifically said to be man only, it appears to also refer to animals. And as I discovered in my essay called Lilith, the Equal of Adam, Sex's Day 7 of Creation, it's quite interesting that creation always happens with animals first and then humans. And I think this is what Guchev is agreeing with, is that Tetatocosmos are just animals. And then you have to make a distinction between animals and humans that are capable of having a first being food, a second being food, and impressions to be able to create a Kesjanian astral body and a potential soul. So you see how these two levels parallel each other. I hope that is clear. It probably takes a bit of studying, but it's really amazing to think about this, that there are 3 levels of creation and then there are 3 growths of man, from human body to Kesjan body and to soul. And interesting that the souls get grouped with the grouping of the suns, and the Kesjan body is in the group that represents the planets. Clearly, the simplest solution is that Hanalut is not one force with 3 aspects, but 3 forces resembling active, passive, and neutralizing within the inner triangle in the Enneagram, Thus, the designation of Hanal-Ut in creation, position Sol La, should be designated as Hanal-Ut number 3, neutral force, acting from Sol La to Do. Then Hanal-Ut number 1, active force, acting from Do to Mi Fa. And Hanal-Ut number 2, passive force, acting from Mi Fa to Sol La. It is Hanal-Ut which controls the creation of the 3 levels of the cosmoses by means of the inner triangle of 3. It allows for a true human to take in the refined, spiritualized materials of the 2 highest sets of cosmoses in the form of air, having become agape love, to form the spirit and impressions, having become the higher reason, to form a soul. Thus man can become the true image of God, rather than being ruled by a very old man with a heavy white beard. Having this blueprint of Hanal-Ut, inner triangle, humans can become part of the realm of planets in the mesocosmos and in the realm of stars in the macrocosmos. Thank you. I hope this is clear, and I know it will take some study, but I've tried to present it as clear as I can.